How are biometrics measured? There's a number of different ways: blood, urine analysis, clinical or lab tests. But I think the most common and frequent example, especially in sport, is wearable technologies or other forms of interactive technologies. So many of us at this very moment probably have an Apple smartwatch on. Smartphones are certainly examples. Equipment that can be worn, such as a heart rate monitor, or even clothing, which is increasingly has various forms of biometric technology built into the equipment itself. In other words, these are becoming increasingly ubiquitous, and they're increasingly posing challenges to the association. It is notable that there are some rules in place from the association as it relates to the use of biometric technology. A couple of guidelines that I think are worth noting. First, our legislation notes that wearable technology can be used, but it must either be counted as CARA hours, those are countable athletically related activities. So when a student athlete is asked to wear such biometric devices, they're on the clock for the counting of those hours. And there's a maximum number of hours associated with our legislation. Otherwise, student athletes are free to use these devices in a voluntary situation, but in those circumstances, they're generally not required and not able to report that information back to a coach or other athletics department member who may have an interest in the data that emerge from those devices. These loose legislative guidelines are accompanied by some sport-specific guidelines as well. So we know in certain sports, for example, football, men's basketball, athletes are able to wear biometric technology such as a heart rate monitor, but only if those data are going to be used for the purposes of tracking on health and safety. And that gives a number of questions that no doubt we'll be entertaining as we go through the remainder of this webinar. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to note that the views, information, and opinions expressed by these panelists during the webinar session are offered in their personal capacity and do not necessarily reflect or align with the position of the institutions or other organizations for which they work. The NCAA has not verified the accuracy of the content that will be presented during this webinar, and it's offering it solely for the purpose of educating and informing the membership. Nothing presented as part of this session is intended to constitute or be a substitute for medical, legal, or other professional advice or services. So with those formalities out of the way, I want to introduce the four panelists that will be joining me for the discussion. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Pam Bruzina. Dr. Bruzina is a professor of nutrition and exercise physiology and the faculty athletics rep at the University of Missouri. She was recently appointed to the NCAA Committee on Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sport, and she also serves as the chair of the Missouri Student Athlete Research Oversight Committee, in an area of involvement for her that's particularly relevant for our discussions today. Dr. Bruzina earned a bachelor's degree in molecular biology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, while also running track and cross country for the Badgers. She completed her doctorate in nutrition science from the University of Wisconsin and did postdoctoral training in the Division of Nutritional Sciences at Cornell University. Her research focuses on the effects of nutrition and exercise on bone health, an interest that's born out of her experience as a student athlete. Joining Dr. Bruzina is Ms. Jess Kerr, Associate General Counsel in the NCAA Office of Legal Affairs. As part of her role, she provides counsel for the NCAA Sports Science Institute, as well as for the NCAA Committee on Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sport. Prior to joining the NCAA in 2017, she spent almost 20 years representing clients in the healthcare industry, first as part of a large international law firm, and later in-house as a business unit general counsel and regulatory expert at Boston Scientific and Medtronic. Before practicing as a lawyer, Ms. Kerr was a standout volleyball student athlete at the University of Notre Dame and subsequently spent 6 years as a D1 volleyball coach at both Notre Dame and Indiana University. Next, Ms. Shelby Lee, a former NCAA Student Athlete Advisory Committee representative, a women's soccer student athlete at the University of California, Irvine. She received a bachelor's degree in public health science from Irvine, and she also served on the Big West National SAC as a representative from 2017 to 2020. She was also on the NCAA Division I Strategic Vision and Planning Committee from 2018 to 2020, and she was a panelist on the time management panel at the National Association for Athletic Compliance in 2018, and a speaker at the United States Olympic Committee Summit on Sexual Abuse in Sport in 2018. She is currently pursuing a master's degree in nursing with a concentration in community and public and population health. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Karen Weaver, an associate clinical professor at Drexel University, LeBow College of Business, and a contributing writer at Forbes magazine, where she is an expert on college sports as they intersect with higher education management, media, and policy. A former Division I and Division III head coach and athletics administrator, Dr. Weaver examines college athletics from the perspective of university presidents and trustees, athletic conference organization, higher education scholars, and sports finance. Her research includes mid-major on football both subdivision Division I institutions, public finance and facility debt policies, and the role that college senior leaders can and should play in managing athletics. And she regularly writes for Forbes and Forbes.com. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes in conversation with the panelists about various aspects of this broad topic of biometrics. I will note that given the expertise of the panelists, many of our conversations are going to focus on the policy landscape surrounding the use of biometric technologies and the exploration or collection of related biometrics data. Again, I'll remind you that there is a chat panel that you're welcome to use. We plan to have this discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we'll try to save somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 minutes at the end of our discussion to then address those questions or any others. So I'll start with a question that I would like each of you to address one by one, a general question. And that is, I mean, we're familiar with your biographies and your experiences now, but perhaps you can take a few minutes to drill down a bit and talk more specifically about either your experience in or your interest in working with biometrics technology and biometrics data. As my orientation noted, it's a broad area, so particularly interested to know what your detailed experience was. And Dr. Bruzina, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, John. And first of all, thank you to the NCAA for this opportunity to talk about this really important topic. We all really appreciate it. So I guess my first experience with biometrics is as John said, if biometrics are physiological, physical, behavioral characteristics of human beings, my experience with biometrics is as a researcher. So I have done some research with student athletes. So I have that experience in my role as a professor. But more recently, my interest in biometrics really has to do with my role as a faculty athletics rep. And as you all know, one of my roles is student athlete welfare. And I've really become aware and to some extent concerned about the use of wearables to measure biometrics in student athletes. And I always feel like I should say, please don't misunderstand and think that I'm opposed to research or studying student athletes. We really do need more information about student athletes, but we need to collect that information in a way that protects student athlete experience and privacy and make sure that those data are kept secured. So really my interest is student athlete welfare and well-being. I'll stop there.
Thanks. I'll build off the emphasis on student athlete and go next to you, Shelby. Same question.
During my time at UC Irvine, I was actually wearing wearable technology during practices, just heart rate monitors. So that's where my personal experience comes in for this conversation, but also my time at National SAC. This conversation came across the table a couple years ago. So we've been discussing it little by little. I think the biggest thing is that not all of our members are users of wearable technology. So a lot of the student athletes at the table just didn't have an opinion because they weren't wearing such technologies. So I think the conversation for me is going to be rooted in including everybody in these things, because I think it's only going to progress with wearable technology. So we want to make sure we have really strong foundations to protect student athlete well-being.
Thanks, Shelby. Dr. Weaver.
Well, thanks everybody, and thanks particularly to the NCAA for having this, I think, very important discussion. I teach a course at Drexel called Sport and Technology, and I ask each of my students to come to class with a new technology that they've been paying attention to. And I had a number of athletes in my classes coming to me and telling me what they were doing at practice. So it led me to asking questions and having conversations with some of the coaches that I know in the area. And I realized that some of the ways and the decisions of why coaches were choosing to use technology were based in the competitive belief that it was going to make their team somehow better without considering the trade-offs. And the trade-offs that I think of in this situation are athlete-informed consent, really understanding from the athlete's point of view what data is being collected and what's being done with it. What the technology company gains by giving you that particular technology and allowing you to use it at a lower cost or no cost, what's the return on investment for them? And then who owns that data going forward? What happens to that data once it's collected from the athlete? And does the athlete have the opportunity to look at it, discuss it, and then decide what happens to it? That is a particularly exploding issue right now, and that's what leads me to want to participate in this conversation today.
Thank you. And Jess, lastly to you, how has your legal experience intersected with biometrics?
Sure, I'll echo everybody's thanks for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate that. As you mentioned, John, prior to coming to the NCAA, I came out of the medical device space. So I spent a number of years practicing with big public companies that manufactured wearable technology, heart pacemakers, defibrillators, chronic pain, neurostimulators, diabetes pumps, all of those kinds of things. And so, as you can imagine, there was a strong interest in that kind of data by the manufacturer, my company that I work for, the patients themselves, but also third parties, insurers, pharma, people that could use the data for their own benefit. And so we spent an awful lot of time trying to understand the issues, the legal risks that come with that, how to address those, how to protect the data, protect the patients. So that's where the interest started and the experience started. Obviously, you mentioned I was a coach, so I have that turned me into a data geek, if you will, those years in the clinical space, and always interested as a former coach and former student athlete in how data can be used, biometrics can be used to further and advance the experience of the student athlete and the programs. And then I've got two high schoolers, both of whom play high-level athletics. And so really curious to see where this is going to go in the future with respect to their experience.
Great, thanks. Appreciate the response from all of you. Dr. Bruzina, I'm going to go to you next and want to do some additional definitional work. So in my opening comments, I define biometric data as metrics related to some aspect of human characteristics, physical, behavioral. Talked a little bit about some of the common physiologic functions that we might expect data to come from: sleep, heart rate, etc. But as a researcher and as somebody that's been involved in committees that have some charge to the oversight of the use of biometric technologies or data, how would you define biometrics? How would somebody who is maybe new to this area and finds themselves with emerging administrative responsibility know biometric data or biometric devices when they see them, especially given the rapid evolution of those things over the last even 5 years?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think if you're sort of new to thinking about this, it's probably good to cast a broad net. So biometrics, sounds like a really scientific, precise kind of term, but it's not. As you said, it really can mean any human characteristic that's physiological or behavioral. So if you think about that long list of things that would fall under there, I think you should think broadly about what could fit that definition. And then, as you said, there's really been an explosion of wearable technology, and that wearable technology has made it very easy to measure biometric data and to measure a lot of biometric data, right? So if you sort of think back to, if I think back to, when I was a student athlete several decades ago, we had heart rate monitors, but that was really it, right? And now we all, as you said, have smart watches and Garmin watches and Fitbits that measure our heart rate, but also can, predict our VO2 max and just measure a lot of different things, right? So we have the biometric data is a broad term, and then we have really any wearable technology is going to be measuring something that would fall under the umbrella of biometric data.
One question before I move on. You hear this buzzword quite often, big data, and I'm wondering from your perspective if there's any natural connection between biometric technologies, associated data, and the big data phenomena.
Yes, absolutely. So this gets to what both Jess and Dr. Weaver were saying. So, you're using a wearable technology that you've purchased from some company. And when, I'm wearing a Garmin watch right now. I buy the Garmin watch. I set up the app on my phone and I click some agreement that I didn't even read, right? That they're going to collect my data, and that data is going to be stored and used to improve their algorithms, right? So it's collecting thousands of data points on me each day and storing those data and pooling those data with all the other people that are wearing Garmin watches and using that data. And because I didn't read the agreement, I'm not sure if they're selling it to somebody else or not, but that is possible, right? So we are in an era where big data, which just means huge data sets with lots of data points, are very valuable. And Jess knows a lot more about that, and Dr. Weaver knows a lot more about that than I do. But yes, there's definitely that connection there.
Thanks. And Dr. Weaver, I'm going to use that to segue to you, because given some of that definitional work, your perspective is really multifaceted, administrative, coach, analyst, expert. I mean, you're really looking at this issue from a number of different angles. Generally speaking, can you describe in a little bit more detail how you've seen or are seeing both these technologies and associated biometric data being used in practice, in real life, whether that's coaching, performance consulting, whatever it is? What's the reality of this all look like?
Well, I'll give you an example. I think the one that was the most startling to me, but it makes sense if you think about what the companies want to get out of it. And that was in 2016 when Nike struck a deal with the University of Michigan to provide all of their performance clothing to the University of Michigan athletes. But at the same time, square up front, the first paragraph said, we want to be able to use your athletes to track the wearable technology that we're building into this program. And in return for doing that, we will give you extra money, and we'll be able to collect data to improve our performance in our clothing and eventually sell that. That makes total sense for Michigan. It makes total sense for Nike. But did the athletes know what was going on? And I think that's the piece of all of this. That's the lens in which I look at this through. Another issue is the idea of tracking athletes. There's an app called EduSpotter, which I wrote about in January, which tracks athletes as to where they walked into a classroom, and a beacon has linked to their phone and said, this is where you are at this moment in time. Are we okay with that? Are they mandated to do that kind of responsive behaviors, or do they have the option to opt in or out? My overall concern is that we have athletes who are being told to do something without understanding what happens to the data and their ownership of it going forward. Really tough example was last week. We had a situation at Texas Tech where a women's basketball coach was fired because the athletes came forward and alleged, among other things, that she was publicly writing their heart rates during a game as tracked by a heart rate monitor, and saying the athletes, you aren't giving enough exertion unless you reach this certain threshold. Well, that is really a poor understanding of how those technologies are supposed to enhance performance. And so my concern is I think we have a lack of complete not understanding of all the different ways this technology benefits the companies that create it, can leverage the talents and expertise of the athletes without them getting any benefit from them. And this I related to names, images, and likenesses. At some point, you own your own right to publicity. And certainly in the area of your own personal data, you own that right as well. If I'm a football player and I want to move on to the NFL, you better believe that the NFL is going to say to every college coach, what data do you have that proves that he's able to perform at this level? And coaches have the power to decide which data goes forward and which doesn't. That's problematic for an athlete who doesn't really know what's going on. And John, if I can add one more thing that's exploded in Europe right now, is that the soccer player union over there has decided that there's a lot of data being collected on all of their athletes. And they have filed a massive lawsuit about who owns this data and what they're able to do with it to be able to monetize their data, just like we would want to monetize names, images, and likenesses.
So perfect segue in your reference to soccer, because of course, Shelby, you are a D1 soccer athlete. You have an experience of one, but you are an athlete in a sport that I know is particularly interested nationally and internationally in trying to understand more deeply patterns of performance and physiology. You have also been very well connected to the SAC infrastructure, and I know that you've talked to many other student athletes and heard their experiences and have been able to compare them to your own. Talk more deeply about it. What is it like as a student athlete who's confronted with, not only decisions about wearing these technologies, but also confronted with the insights that they may bring or not bring about the way you're playing, about the way that you're training. What does this all look like from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to thank everybody for having the student athletes at top of mind in all of these points. I would say that my personal experience and the experience of fellow student athletes that I know and concerns here are when you continue to trot down numbers about an athlete. I know with soccer, for me, it's not as clear cut with statistics as, say, baseball is with pitch count and all those things. So if you wear this wearable technology and you're starting to look for trends in certain sports, you attach your performance with those trends and the numbers, and you're trying to see a pattern. So I think from a student athlete perspective, I get concerned for mental health of student athletes, because as this increases with tracking everything that we can possibly track, you're going to get people that become obsessive over that. I know myself, and I know my other fellow student athletes, we want to perform, and we want to perform to the best of our ability. So I think coming at this conversation, I just challenge everybody to remember that the student athlete is already in a very high achieving area, but we're always looking to be better. And there needs to be mental health implications and mental health created to protect student athletes from themselves in these sort of situations. And as you said, I think it's all about numbers in sports. And I've seen personally student athletes that didn't react well to always tracking their data. I know I'm a female in a female sport, and I watched when we did weigh-ins before and after practice and the impact on fellow student athletes, that wasn't something that they took well too. So I think my greatest concern here is, as you introduce more numbers, as you introduce more biometrics for performance, how are we making sure that the student athlete overall is doing well with those things in place?
Before I move away from you, Shelby, is there an example experience that you have or that you've heard from your colleagues that demonstrate some of these concerns or perhaps some of the issues that Dr. Weaver enumerated?
I know that I used two different wearable technologies during my time. One was the heart rate monitor. We wore that a lot, but I didn't see a lot of the data from those. Another was a company that tracked, it was very specific, and it tracked how quickly you ran, how many sprints you had in a game. It would track all the things, and then it would put it into video. So it tracked film on those certain, like your highest sprint, it would show you your sprint while you were doing it. Oftentimes I gave the ball back, so I was running back to defense. That's why I was running so fast. So I think that that's something that is obviously super interesting for the student athlete to look at. But we were getting an email from an outside company showing us those things. So I'm like, oh, this is so amazing as a student athlete. I'm like, this is bright and shiny and things that I can attainably see. But from these conversations, it's like, should I ensure that there was a protection that wasn't then put somewhere else without my consent? I think that's the greater conversation, is what is the structure to protect the student athletes from themselves, like I've mentioned. Because if you give us a bright and shiny Apple Watch, I'm wearing mine right now, we're obviously going to be very excited about it and we're going to want to use it. But do we really know what we're signing up for is going to be the greater conversation here.
Thank you, Shelby. So, Jess, we've been talking, I don't know, for maybe a little bit under 15 minutes, and I've already heard words or phrases like ownership and surveillance and tracking and mental health. I'm no lawyer, but I know enough to know that administratively, legally, or otherwise, they can all be bundled together in a frame of risk. So from your perspective as a practicing lawyer, what are the main components of risk that schools need to be contemplating as they think about the use of these technologies and they think about the use and integration of these data?
Sure. And I think you've already heard a lot about those risks. I'll try to bucket them. I think generally speaking, not even in the college athletic space, largely it's about the individual rights, right? So here we're talking about student athletes. In the space I came from, we were talking about patients. But it's this idea of who owns the data and the information. And in the college athletic space, you've got 18 to 22-year-olds. So we are no longer dealing with their guardians and their parents. We don't have to provide them with any information about what we're mandating for those student athletes, and yet they're 18 to 22, highly distracted, often by shiny new toys. And so it's really, even if we inform them about what we're doing, do they really understand it? And are they really in a position to negotiate in a way that they should when it involves their rights? So it's this idea of imbalance of power between the manufacturers, the institutions, often the conferences, if it's a conference-wide deal, and those student athletes. So that's the first bucket is really student athlete rights and who owns and controls the data. And then the second bucket is, what are you doing with the information, right? So even if you're authorized and the student athletes consent to it, the scope of use, if you will, should be really narrowly tied to the need and the reasonable, appropriate need. So if it's health and safety information or performance information that will help the student athlete, then the scope of the use of that data really should be tied to that. And there should be periodic, monitoring of that. So you run into trouble when you get creative institutions. So they went into it with one idea and very quickly it morphs because they get creative and they're like, we could also use it for this and that. And as you mentioned, there are the rogue scenarios where the data could be used by authorized users in ways that hurt the student athletes to prevent them from transfer, for example, or to prevent them from leaving and going professionally. And then the last bucket is really the protection of the data from unauthorized users. So the hackers. And you all know in the world of Zoom that we're living in, you've probably all been involved with at least one scenario where people are able to access technology in a way that was not intended. And certainly wearable devices, biometric data is very, very vulnerable to that. So, Dr. Weaver brought up the Michigan contract, and at one point, the student athletes, the data that was being collected was well beyond the scope of what should have been collected. And it was very private, and it was very personal. They were not aware of that. And if somebody were to, they resolved that issue once they found out about it. But if somebody were to get a hold of that and post it on social media, it would be detrimental, obviously. So it's that last bucket is really, how do you protect the data from unintended use, unauthorized use?
Dr. Weaver, I want to come back to you, and in just a second, I'll talk with Dr. Bruzina about some of the regulatory activities that she's been involved in, the oversight activities. But before we do that, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more, not necessarily about the legal risk that Jess talked about, but speak more deeply about some of the moral and ethical concerns or considerations. You know, you mentioned in consent, and several of the themes that you identified in your previous remarks resonate with those of Jess's, which were more formalized from the legal perspective. Take a step deeper into some of the moral and ethical concerns that worry you.
Yeah, I think as I've asked questions about how we use technology for college students, whether they be students or whether they be athletes, I really get to the point of understanding, do we as adults really understand what we're asking and allowing the technology to do for us? A really good example is what's happening right now with campuses who want to bring students back and want to be able to track their COVID-19 exposures. So apps are being marketed to campuses that they say they can contact trace anybody who's within your range. If suddenly you present symptoms, well, quickly the campus sees, well, I can then see who else they were in contact with and immediately isolate them. But that requires the athlete to be tracked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And what happens to that data? Another example is there's a recruiting company who has all of its data uploaded to Amazon Web Services, which is one of the largest clouds in the world for securing data. And they were hacked. They did not have good security systems in place. So thousands of high school recruits had their data exposed. And I'm very concerned about the fact that high school recruits now are being asked to upload their performance data so the coaches can see what it looks like. And there's no regulation really for that across the high school. I go back to the shiny object thing. And my favorite shiny object is my phone, and it's with me all the time. But I have to be careful about what I put on here because some of these apps are a little less ethical than others, and they track where you go and who you're in contact with. And there's a lot of incentive for technology companies to monetize that. And so that's a really important part of this bigger picture that I think college sports needs to pay attention to.
So I think that's a good punctuation point, and I'm going to pivot from there for these next couple of questions to talk a little bit more about practices and administrative solutions to some of these concerns that we've noted. And Dr. Bruzina, I want to go to you to start that conversation. You've had unique involvement in policy development and oversight at Missouri, specifically being part of the Student Athlete Research Oversight Committee. And I'm wondering if you could talk in a little bit more detail about that experience. What was the source of the development of the committee, and on a day-to-day basis, what's the scope of consideration?
Okay, so we have the Student Athlete Research Oversight Committee as sort of one measure of protecting student athletes, and then we also have a tech committee, which is another approach. So if there's time, I can talk about both of those. So. Please. Okay, so the Student Athlete Research Oversight Committee was developed about a year and a half ago, and it really came out of a request to use student athletes as research participants, which isn't unusual, but the scope of the research project was pretty involved and rather intensive. So there was going to be a lot of data collected on a lot of student athletes for a long time. Which is kind of an unusual request. So that gave us a pause and started to think about, well, you know, how should we protect student athletes when we get these types of requests to allow them to be research participants? So, you know, I was sort of put in charge of that responsibility, putting a committee together, and I looked at what some other institutions were doing. And we put together a committee that has athletics representatives, so a representative of the athletics director, sports medicine, strength and conditioning, psychology, and then there's 3 faculty members on there whose research is in areas that would likely be the focus of studies with student athletes. I'm on there, a former student athlete is on there, and then a member of the public. And so this committee reviews all requests that we get to use our student athletes as research participants. And really, the first question is this project going to benefit student athletes, like the current student athletes, right? Are they going to benefit in any way? Is the athletics program going to benefit in any way? And that's really sort of a question that athletics is primarily responsible for answering, because it is their enterprise after all. And then if the answer is yes, it might benefit them, then we ask the next questions, like what is going to be the burden on the student athlete? Is it going to be too much time? Do we think it's going to be too invasive? Is it going to be something like Shelby was saying that might affect mental health, right? And that's where we get input from the psychologists on the committee. And then we start looking at the informed consent process. As Jess said, athletics is a very unique environment when it comes to consent. Student athletes sign countless forms, right? And you just sign it. You don't really feel like you have a choice about whether you sign it, if you want to participate in the program or keep your scholarship or whatever. You just sign, right? So the informed consent process is really important for research with student athletes, that they don't feel coerced and they don't feel there's going to be any negative consequence for not participating. So we pay a lot of attention to that. So it's really sort of balancing the benefit to the current student athletes and then the burden on them. And then beyond that, the data itself, how are those data going to be secured, and how are they going to be used, and who's going to use them? And something that we haven't really talked about is sort of the tracking of hours, right? Countable hours and all those sort of compliance issues. So is the coach going to have access to them? Like who's going to have access, and then how are the data going to be protected and secured? So it's really a comprehensive overview. And then another thing that we have built in that's a responsibility of this committee is to report regularly to SAC. So we meet with SAC to get their feedback on, like, if they have been a research participant, how has that experience been for them, and then to just sort of update them on the requests for studies that we get and the ones that we approve, and just sort of to track with them. And then also similar reporting like that to the chancellor, because it is his committee. So we have that when the use of the biometric data and the data that's being collected from the wearables would fall under the umbrella of research. But then we also have this tech committee, which is also relatively recent. And this tech committee approves any technology purchase from athletics. And what was happening was that sport programs were seeing the shiny new toys, right? It's not just student athletes or faculty members who are like, ooh, right? Coaches do that too, especially when they think there might be, some performance benefit to be gained. So, and, they hear so-and-so has such and such, so they want it too. And so they were independently wanting to purchase different technologies, right? Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. There could be some sharing of the wearable devices among sport programs, which would be a cost savings, which is a big motivator here. So we decided that it would be better if all of the wearable technologies sort of went through this committee, and this committee is somebody from the business office, IT, athletic performance or strength and conditioning, compliance, and then me. And so really it's going to be the athletic performance people who are sort of the go-to people for the technology. So they're going to be sort of responsible for holding the wearable devices. And then something Shelby mentioned earlier, they're going to be the ones who have the data, who analyze the data and translate it into something that's meaningful for the coaches. So the coaches aren't going to see the raw data and try and make sense of it. The student athletes aren't going to just see all the raw data and try and make sense of it. They're going to be the translators. And we've also applied that principle, Shelby, to weighing body weight and body composition for that very same reason, right? So they're sort of the gatekeepers of both the wearables and the data. So this committee has to approve the purchase of a wearable technology, and so it can only be used during countable hours. You can't take it home with you unless a student athlete voluntarily requests it, and then they have to fill out a sign out form, and they're saying in that sign out form, I'm not going to share this data with a coach or any other athletics staff member. So trying to sort of have that protection in both areas. And just one quick thing about, I think a lot of times, at least that was my experience, athletics administrators aren't thinking about research. They don't really know what research is, but oftentimes what the data they're collecting and how they're using it could morph into research and fall under the federal definition of research. And then need to go through the appropriate approvals for doing research. So that means your campus IRB, and in our case, also the Student Athlete Research Oversight Committee. So sorry, I tried to be quick, but I talked for a long time.
No, thank you. I appreciate the detail. And Shelby, I want to go to you next for some reaction. Again, based on your experiences, your concerns, those from student athletes, did what Dr. Bruzina described as some degree of administrative oversight, does that seem well positioned to respond to the things that are of concern to you and other student athletes?
Yes, absolutely. I think just having student athletes in those conversations is going to get you a lot of the information that they're looking for. I think the only other concern I might have going into the future of using wearable technology, like Dr. Weaver kind of alluded to, is what are the protections if something is going wrong once you've been wearing it? Like, what are the reporting structure? So obviously, maybe when you're signing your consent form, you're also getting educated on, hey, if your coach starts to say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, I'm seeing this trend, but that's not what you're signing up for, who could you talk to? I think that's just the unfortunate reality. I like to make sure we know the pathway, and then that provides just further protection once the ball gets rolling on all this stuff. Because obviously the research and all that is very interesting and has a lot of positives to it, but we always want to protect the student athletes.
Right. So Jess, last question to you, and then we'll go to questions from our participants. Generally speaking, from a legal perspective, what are some strategies that schools should be contemplating with their local counsel?
Sure. And again, I think Pam just laid out exactly the map that everybody should be following, and Shelby supplemented the map. So obviously, as a lawyer, my first suggestion would be to involve somebody from legal or risk management on your campus. There's a lot of stakeholders that can add to the value of the conversation around this well on the front end of any contract or any implementation of these kinds of biometric devices. So it's not just the lawyers and the risk managers, somebody from student life, right? So somebody who can speak to the impact. We, as the NCAA, emphasize consistently that to the extent it makes sense, to the extent possible, these student athletes should be treated like students. So yes, they're going to go to practice. Yes, they're going to compete. But just like, the cello player, when they go home, they're not a cello player, they're a student. And so we should be thinking through the impact, if it's reasonable for a student athlete and what we're asking of them. And then you move into the education piece, right? So it is very important, whether it's the risk managers or the lawyers or somebody from student life or somebody from research or the coaches and administrators, but student athletes really need a student athlete level understanding of what they're getting into. They need an advocate, really, somebody who's disinterested to explain what their rights are, to explain that path if something goes wrong. I know most schools now have a compliance line or a complaint line, whatever you want to call it, 1-800, I don't like what's happening here. This process should be part of that. So they should be able to report anonymously that things are happening that they're not comfortable with. And that should be subject to a non-retaliation policy as well. So these are all things that you should be thinking about well on the front end. If you don't have lawyers, if you don't have risk managers, if you do and their eyes glaze over when you mention biometrics or wearable devices, then stop the process until you have informed people around the table. It's a big deal. IT is very important. So mapping the data flow from start to finish and really understanding what happens with the data at each point of the process and where your vulnerabilities are, both in terms of scope creep, use creep, and unauthorized hacking is very, very important. And to be able to articulate that when something goes wrong, to identify the issue, fix the issue, and share the issue with the impacted individuals, all of that should be planned for before you enter into this kind of agreement. So that's very scary. That's my job, is to scare everybody into pausing. But the benefits, the upsides of technology are significant. And like I said, I'm a self-proclaimed data geek. So it's just a matter of getting it right and really and doing it well when you're doing it.
So we've gone through our prepared questions. I want, as I noted at the beginning, to provide an opportunity for questions from those of you that are our guests. Encourage you to add those now to the chat if you have them. As I understand it, and as I'm looking, we don't have any submitted yet, but we'll keep our eyes open. And while we're waiting for questions, let me pose one more specific question in the group, not necessarily so much focused on regulatory or oversight issues, but more on outcome and product. My background is as an athletic trainer. I've talked to the athletic training and physician community, the strength and conditioning community. I mean, the holy grail here is that we find a way with these large volumes of data to generate some very unique insight that gives us competitive advantage. But the question that everybody seems to continue to wrestle with is, what is the state of those insights? Do we seem to have emerging, well-validated, scientifically validated insights that we can consistently rely on to inform the structure of practice and the periodization of training across the year? And at least my read of things is that there continues to be a lot of ambiguity around that we're still not completely sure about the quality of insights that we're getting from some of these data. And that's not helped by the fact that we seem to be working very siloed, right? This school's doing one thing, this school's doing another. Just a general question to any of you who want to respond. What is your perspective on that issue? Are we developing actionable insight from this whole effort?
I'll jump in and give you this perspective, because I think that is the ultimate end game, right? But right now, what's happening in the tech space is there is a ton of venture capital money being dumped into the space in the hopes of creating the next great X. And they haven't actually thought that all the way through. All they're thinking about is, how many subscriptions can I sell? How many phone placements can I get so I can collect even more data? Remember, sometimes technology is not about the data you're collecting, it's access to other data that they're able to use, because we all like the shiny new thing. So I think I'd be very skeptical at this point about the longer term view as to how relevant some of this data will be to enhancing performance. And I also want to add one other thing. I've noticed a trend right now in minor league baseball, where minor league baseball is starting to believe that they do not need to have minor league teams, because they can actually accumulate data through video technology and then be able to use it to judge performance. If you think of MLBAM and all the technology that's existed now that we can see the flight of the ball and all those kinds of things. So those athletes aren't even on site. They're being videoed, but then the data is being taken off of the video and being taken somewhere else. So this is an area that is exploding, and I am concerned that we haven't gotten that point, John, because we're just so concerned about aggregating the other data that we can get from being part of this space.
Okay. Any other responses to that question? Otherwise, we do have one submitted from the participants. Go ahead, Jess.
I'll counter quickly with the optimism. I have seen technology, and again, it's not consistently used, but I have seen, as a health and safety lawyer, I've seen it used more in the professional ranks than at the college ranks to help coaches determine when they need fresh legs, for example, right? So when they're going to get maximum performance, if they should save that maximum performance. So hockey is one sport where with the shifts should be shorter. So they're using the science, and I think it depends on who's on staff, right? If they're data geeks, if they know how to use the data, how interested the coaches are in using the data. But I've seen some fairly interesting examples of good use of data toward health and safety and performance recently. So again, back to your idea of silos, that information and how it's being used could be shared to the benefit of all, I think a little bit better than it is right now.
John, can I just jump in quickly on that also?
Please do.
So from a researcher perspective, I think the siloing is a big issue. So to answer some of these questions about, what's going to reduce injury risk in particular or enhance performance, you need large data sets, right? And so you need researchers who are committed to answering specific research questions and gathering large amounts of data over time so they can really get more valid answers. And I think there's sort of that conflict of the technology is being used by athletics for more of a quick fix or a quick answer to the question rather than a research perspective. And again, the siloing comes from the competitiveness of athletics and not wanting to share everything, right? So they sort of have these, yes, athletics would like to know the answers, but they're also focused more short term. So I think that will always be a part of the problem.
There is two questions submitted now. I'm gonna go to the first one in order. Do you see the NCAA adjusting rules for the use of wearable technology? We have, for example, Shot Tracker here that our conference paid to install, but students can't use it on their own because coaches have access to the information. So I'll just give a brief response, and I'll note that, of course, that kind of decision, a change in the legislative landscape, is certainly not something that NCAA staff can affect or facilitate. That would have to arise from deliberations from the membership and appropriate committees that would have some touch on those issues. And I'm not aware that there's any current discussion amongst those committees, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. I will just say, from a Committee on Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sport perspective, and I can say this because I'm the liaison to that committee, they've entertained general questions about wearable technologies on a number of occasions in the last couple of years. And their general commentary has been about the way in which these technologies are being used on campus. And they've really encouraged a breakdown of those use silos. In many cases, we see these technologies and the data really being kept to coaches, strength and conditioning, and sport. And there's not always good connection back to the medical side, the physicians and the athletic trainers. And so what CSMAS has largely said is, listen, we think a permissive environment is appropriate. We would like to see there be more use because, to Jess's point, we think we're optimistic about the insights from a health and safety perspective that can be generated, but we really think use locally needs to be integrated across all units, medical, performance, sport coach, or otherwise, that be able to provide benefit. I'll turn the floor over to any of you who have additional comment, or if there are staff on the line that want to comment about ongoing discussions in the membership, I'd encourage you to join. Okay, hearing none, I'll go to the next question. Curious if we are at a stage yet where we can judge if the increased collection and use of this data is leading to better outcomes and decisions. I think that's an extension of the question that I asked you all a bit earlier. Anything that you want to add to either of these questions?
I'll just jump in on that. I think you're absolutely right to identify this challenge, this tension between a quick fix and the longer term benefits for having these kinds of things. And I think that what Jessica said earlier about involving a group of people, including the risk management folks, in the decisions about what technology you want to use with your athletes on the front end is a really valuable start in this whole process. And that way, then you can involve people who are involved in research to understand, okay, are we actually allowing for informed consent when we tell our athletes to put on their heart rate monitor or to use a sleep technique, sleep band? So those kinds of things, I think, are the next steps in this process of trying to take this great new technology and marry it with the informed consent and the ultimate individual liberties that are part of this as well.
I'm going to take those comments, Dr. Weaver, as our last word. I see that we're up against the top of the hour, and I see no additional incoming questions from our participants. So I want to thank, first of all, the four of you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. I want to thank the participants for your interest in the topic. And as I understand it, this is a topic that will continue to get attention and will likely be the topic, some aspect of it at least, for future webinars such as this and as hosted by our colleagues in academic and membership affairs. So again, thank you, everybody. Hope you found it valuable, and we'll look forward to engaging with you on this topic at some point in the future. Have a good day.
Thank you.